Sound Speeds. Welcome back to the Sound Speeds podcast, a member of the Geeks Rising podcast community. Let's waste no time and get right into our content. As of the time of this recording, I boomed my first feature just shy of 25 years ago. So I'm going to go ahead and round up to 25 because it's a nice round number and it's going to look better in the thumbnail. Now, I'm going to say this also. I have worked in some aspect of sound for over 30 years. The very first show I ever did was actually on theater. It was a theater show called A Chorus Line. And I was in the sound department for that show, wiring up people and that kind of thing. And that was in 1992. But I've been involved in some aspect of production, even if it was public access television, which is originally where I started since 1994. So that's over 30 years. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because I have been doing some aspect of production for a while. So content creation is in my blood. Producing is in my blood. I produced my first show when I was 17, and that was over 30 years ago also. So that's fun. I spent like all the money that I'd been saving up for months to get a couple of editing VCRs. And then when I graduated high school, I bought a Videonics MX1 digital video mixer. It was 4 channels and did special effects and that kind of thing. So I was actually tape-based editing from one VCR to another, and it had the ability to do insert edits and that kind of stuff. If you know, you know. Now, in this modern era, it's so easy to just go click, click, drag this over this way. You could not do that back then. It was committed to tape as soon as you pressed the record button from and taped something onto it. And if you had to go back and insert a clip or whatever else, you had to edit everything after that. It was a totally different world. Anyway, let me not get onto this side tangent because I will go into a billion of them. But the reason I wanted to mention the thing about production is because I have been doing this for a long time. And so I've seen a lot of changes throughout the years, even in the past, like from the very first feature I ever worked on, which I didn't even do the whole thing. I just did a few days on it. But that was an experience. And even back then, things were totally different than they are right now. So in this list that I'm going to be going through 10 things that have changed in the world of production in the past 25 years, I'm not going to cover certain things that are just industry wide or not just film industry, but let's say workforce wise. Like, for example, diversity. Like if you look at early pictures of, for example, Gone with the Wind, it was all men. It was all white men. Well, guess what? We now have people of all kinds of ethnicity and genders on set, just like in the workforce in general. So do I need to cover that? No, because everybody every workforce is diverse. It doesn't matter if you're in business, if you're on set, if you work in a grocery store, doesn't matter. Some shows are going to have, for example, if you work on a Tyler Perry show or something like that, you may expect there to be just nothing but black people there. No. It's still diverse all the way across the way. Now, if you work on some shows like P-Valley, they do try to focus more on getting women on board because of the sensitive nature of the content. But even then, there were still men all over the place. It's diverse on set. So just like it is in the workforce. But here's where I'm going to go with this list. I'm going to cover 10 things that I've observed that have changed in the past 25 years that I have been doing these movies and television shows. And it's going to be a fun list to go through because there's going to be a lot of reminiscing and remembering the way things were. And if you are a younger person on set, you're going to think that some of this stuff is crazy, ridiculous. How could that be acceptable or whatever? Well, guess what? It used to be even crazier before my time. So this is one of those things where it was even worse before I got on set and started doing movies and television shows. The first thing, let's start off with, is something that is near and dear to sound people's hearts: food. Now, back then, I remember hearing one of my sound mixer friends told me that he did a very small, low budget show in Alabama, I think it was, or something like that. And their craft services was bananas, RC Cola, and moon pies. Oh yeah, there's some Alabama craft services for you. Now, when I first started full time, there were some caterers, and let me also, before I go deeper into this thing, because I barely started, let me also say here, I have never worked in a production city like New York, Los Angeles, one of the big ones. I've only worked in small markets, so it's probably a very different experience in the bigger cities. I'm sure it is. but I'm going to be talking about from my perspective in a smaller market that has blown up to be like the number one production city in the country. So that's where I'm coming from. And there you go. So anyway, let's talk about food. When we only got an occasional show every now and then because the tax incentives were fresh and new here, there were some caterers that you would go up to a window and you would tell them what you wanted, and they would plate up your food for you. They were not necessarily the big shows. The big shows would always have like a buffet style. They would set food out there and you go and get it and sit down. And depending on the caterer, sometimes they would just put water out on the table. And you would go and sit down and you would, eat and pour water and what have you. Sometimes they would have tea or lemonade or something like that. Or sometimes you would have to go and raid craft services and then take whatever that drink was to catering in order to eat. Eat food with the drink of your choice. It just kind of depended. But in the early days, there were some caterers in town that you would go up to the window. And I'm not talking about breakfast. Breakfast is on a food truck. The caterer you just go up to the window and you'd order, and it's like a food truck style, but you don't pay for it. It's a bit different back then because now you go through the buffet. Back then, it was some of these caterers, you'd go up to the window and you would say, I want this and this and this, and they would portion it out for you. So if you wanted to have a little bit more, they wouldn't necessarily give it to you. If you wanted to have, and you could go back and get it, but it wasn't like, sometimes I would go to the rib station. And if it was a buffet style, I would just load my plate up, with ribs. And sometimes they would have something really, really good that was just like, oh, this stuff is awesome. And I would just load up my plate with it. But, other people, would do the same thing with other things too. And that might be the reason why they portion control, because in those days, it was the early days of the incentive and they probably did not have a huge budget and they wanted to make sure that everybody could eat. Some of the shows that I worked on, there was one show that they would ration out certain meat. They would say, you're allowed to have one meat, one steak, one chicken, or what else would there be? Steak or chicken? Steak or chicken. And no, I'm not thinking about like, fish, because normally there's a flying beast, a swimming beast, and a grazing beast. So you would end up having some sort of fish, some sort of chicken or bird, and then some sort of a grazing, cow, pig, something like that, and that would be the way it is. So food has changed. And the big driving force behind that is diets. We normally eat healthier this day and age than we did back then. And even craft services, it used to be junk food, just junk food. But now there's healthier choices. Now you go over there and you could always go to craft services and get like banana and apple, something like that. But now there's, Trader Joe's, mango, and different varieties of nuts and different things like that. Now, obviously, if you get on something like an Oreo commercial, craft service is going to make sure every single flavor of Oreo ever invented is going to be there. You go on an M&M's commercial, it's going to have a billion different flavors of M&M's on the craft services table because they're going to want that brand recognition and everyone to say, oh, cool, I've never seen pretzel Oreos before. The chocolate covered pretzel flavored Oreos. Or I saw tiramisu cream flavored Oreos just today in a store. And I was like, wow, that's trippy. But those are the kinds of things. They would go far and out and buy everything random that they possibly could this day and age. But back then it was just like, okay, well, just, get it, throw it out on the table. And, when they eat it, they eat it. Some people back in the day used to actually, if they were in craft services and they didn't have a huge budget, they would buy some stuff that they knew the crew weren't going to eat because it would always be out there and it would not be eaten, but the crew, it would look like there's always options for the food, for the crew to eat. And so it wouldn't disappear and it wouldn't attack their budget. So some people would actually do that. But this day and age, you have vegans, you have pescatarians, you have people that can't have gluten, you have all these different things. People can't have milk. And so you have to have all the nut and silk and whatever rice, what they call milk. I mean, where do you get milk from rice? But, they do somehow. So anyway, that is one thing that has changed about film sets is the food, because everybody has different diets. Everybody has different eating styles, and they want to make sure they cater literally to those needs. The second thing I'm going to mention here is the length of the days. It used to be that we would just go to work and we would be there forever. Some days it would be in excess of an 18-hour day, and then you'd go to sleep. You would have a minimal turnaround, and they would just pay the fees or whatever, and you'd come back 6 hours later and you do it again. Sometimes there were some shows that I would work on that were nonstop 18-hour days, and they were ridiculously long. But in recent years, it has gotten a lot more tame. Not just because of the extra penalties that are being put on shows for going later, because it could be very easy to justify it and say, well, we could split this day into 2 days, or we could just do one long day. And a lot of the times, if it was like a location shoot, a lot of the producers would say, well, it's cheaper to just get a location for one day. And so let's do it that way. This day and age, they're having to be a lot more creative in the way that they do their schedules. And they're also able to do things a lot more efficiently. So if you go onto a show, most of the time, they're going to try to prep more. They're going to try to plan ahead a little bit better. So that way, when you get there, you can concentrate more on shooting. There's going to be a rigging team that comes out there and pre-rigs everything and gets everything ready. There's a lot more choreography. So that way they don't have to spend, like if you're in a big dance number, you don't have to spend the first 6 hours of everybody trying to tweak the dance moves and whatever. They might bring people in early or the day before and be working on the dancing for a few days in advance and then come out there. And so that way, once everything's lit, and a lot of the times it's already pre-lit, and you can come out there and be part of a pre-lighting event or something like that. And it would be ready to go. So long days are something that is not really happening a whole lot anymore. Contracts are part of the reason. But the biggest reason is that a lot of the people this day and age, they don't want the money. They would say, I would just rather have a decent day. As I understand it, when production first started way back in the day, it was an 8-hour day. But then people wanted more money and they weren't in a position to give it. So they started saying, I'll pay you for a 10-hour day and you could just work 8. But then people, after everybody started getting those deals, they'd say, well, geez, if we're paying everyone for 10 hours, let's work them 10 hours. So then they would say, okay, well, I want, to be paid for 12. Okay, fine. So once everybody started being paid for 12 and only working 10, they said, well, let's just, work you 12. And then it was like, okay, well, why don't we just pay an hourly wage and pay double time after this and 1.5 times after this. And that's how it got crazy, is just people wanting to work long days and doing that because that's what was expected. If you want to work in this industry, we're going to hit you hard while you're there, and it's going to be long hours and craziness. Look up some of the early days of movies, like, for example, Wizard of Oz. One of the reasons why Judy Garland got into really bad shape was because she was working long hours. She was a minor at the time. And first of all, she was told she was fat, which she very much isn't, even according to today's standards. Even according to 80s and 70s standards, she still wasn't fat. But they told her she was fat. So she was restricted from eating, and she was basically just given coffee and like a very minimum amount of food. And she was being pushed for such a long period of time on set that she was exhausted, and she would be dozing off all the time. So they gave her drugs to keep her butt awake. And then at the end of the day, they would say, okay, you're going to have like 2 or 3 hours before you're going to be called back in, and you have to start everything over again. And she would be like, okay, well, I can't get to sleep because I'm, on all these drugs. So they gave her something to knock her out. And then they would wake her up a few hours later and give her something to get her going again. Could you imagine that? First of all, as a minor. Second of all, just in general, that doesn't happen anymore. And that was long before my time. So even in the time that I was there, though, I remember some very, very long days. I remember crew members that would just lean and they would hug, just putting their arms around each other and resting their heads on each other's shoulders. And they would just lay there in order and kind of lean against each other to doze off, because that's all you could do to keep going. If you had a couple of moments, just lean against somebody and hope that they would, doze off also, and one of you wouldn't move and drop the other person. I mean, there were some days that were just ridiculously long. And I know that there were some shows that were so long that when they would say that's a wrap, some crew members would put away their gear and then literally just fall asleep on the ground. There was one show that I know worked a 22-hour last day on a show, on last day on set, and they quite literally laid down on the ground when it was done. And there was a whole bunch of crew people just laying there because everyone was exhausted and no one was going to drive home after working 22 hours. That's almost a double length day. And so they didn't do that. And they just basically laid there and until they were rested enough to leave in a couple of hours or whatever. Craziness. We don't do those kinds of hours anymore. A lot of the contracts that we work, it's double time after 12. Some of them are 14 hours elapsed, meaning that if you have a half-hour lunch, then you can't work more than a 13-and-a-half-hour day. If you have a hard hour lunch, you can't work more than a 13-hour day because after 14 hours, that's when you're going to end up having the big penalties kick in gear. And companies like Warner Brothers, they say no 14+ hour days. 14 hours is a hard cutoff limit. You got to wrap. And they tell the producers and the UPM and stuff, you must wrap. You're not going to work the crew over 14 hours. So some people take that very, very seriously. Some studios take that very, very seriously, and you don't end up doing it. They will have no problem calling you in for a Saturday. If you're on a Monday through Friday show, quite often they'll call you in on a Saturday and say, all right, we're going to be working a Saturday. And they won't tell you until Friday at lunch. They'll say, oh yeah, we're going to be working you tomorrow, but we'll try to do it as a light day. So we'll try to work you no more than 10 hours. You're like, great, there we go. And that happens. But they don't work you extended, long, crazy hours anymore. They also don't do short turnarounds as often anymore, which is like the amount of time you have off, where normally, I think contractually, it's like 10, 11 hours for IATSE crew members. But, it used to be that some of these shows, they would say, okay, well, we'll see you in 8 hours because we need to have all that daylight. And if there was meal penalties or something like that, you would end up driving an hour home. You take a shower, you go to bed, sleep maybe 4 hours, 5 hours, something like that. You'd get up and go back. And you would do the same thing routinely. So it was a different world altogether back then. The other one, the third thing I'll mention is that, and this is something specific to sound, the post-audio mix, this day and age, is seldom used for anything other than just a reference. If you're on set, a lot of the time the mix track that the mixer is mixing live is going to be heard by the director, producer, UPM, above the line, script supervisor, all those kinds of people. Sometimes it would also be sent through the internet to the studios. That way they could listen to it wherever they happen to be, if they're shooting on remote. But that is usually the extent of where it's going to be used, aside from the dailies mix. So the dailies are basically, which is done digitally now. It used to be that they would develop the film, they would take the roll of audio, and then they would synchronize them together. And crew members, this is before my time, they would get together and watch the footage, the best takes from the previous day's work. And that would be how they start their day. And they would do that to get an idea of how their work was yesterday. And they would do that. This day and age, only select people are able to see this. And you would do 20 takes and they would print 3 of them, and then you would have those, and it would sync the audio to picture. But the audio mix is something the sound mixer is mixing for that. And because of the world of ISO recording, so recorders now have multiple tracks. So you can record, channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, all wireless, and then you can have your mix track. And then you can also have a boom track and a second boom track and whatever, plants or whatever. Everything is isolated. So in post, a lot of the time what they'll do, as opposed to taking the audio mix where mixers are going to go up and down with their levels. And since sets are getting to be pretty noisy, a lot of the time in the modern era of digital, there's different levels of fans and all kinds of noise making things on set. It's a lot different of a world, and room tone isn't something that they really get anymore. So there will be a team of people that scrub each track. And then when it finally gets in there, it's a very best possible scrub track. Then somebody will come in there and actually mix it, and then they'll tweak it and stuff like that as needed. But most of the time, post will actually remix the mix track, and they're not going to They're not going to use the mix track very often at all, unless it's just as a reference to hear what it could sound like. And in the same kind of world, post is also a lot less nitpicky about certain sounds than they used to, mainly because of things like Isotope RX and how they can remove a lot of sounds without cutting too badly into the dialogue. Because the dialogue is what is critical. You can record whatever you want there. It can be Foley. It can be, someone typing on a computer keyboard or what have you. Whatever is going on in the scene is going to be what we put a microphone on. But that kind of stuff can be replaced in post. The voice dialogue from actors can't be. So that is what we need to make sure is most pristine and best possible audio recording. And that is what most of the time post will, not in real time. So you could use like one of those DNS units that basically is able to clean up a lot of audio on the fly, or even use like a Super CMET or something like that microphone. And it will listen to the environment and try to reduce it on the fly too. Those are real time. And post doesn't have to be real time. They can go through and tweak things as needed. They could run a plug-in and then they could say, you know what, I think I'm going to manually take care of that to make it even better. And when they do that, it's going to give much better results. And using a mix track where you're constantly adjusting levels or bring this one down, because it used to be that it was just basically one microphone. It was the boom. And you'd bring up the boom and you might adjust the level a little bit as needed if the person got loud or got overly quiet. But if you watch a lot of those early movies, a lot of older movies, most of the time people spoke at the same kind of level. And if they yelled, the microphone, the boom operator would go high with the microphone. So that way the ambience level is, we still do that, but it would try to maintain the levels that way the mixer doesn't really have to adjust that level at all. That's the goal, for the mixer to not have to mix. But this day and age, they're mixing in a lot with a different noise floor. They're mixing in different microphones, different plants, different sensitivities, different noise floor levels and stuff. So your noise floor is constantly going to change, and is a lot better and easier for a post dialogue editor, post sound mixer to recreate the mix track rather than try to fix it. So there's one thing. Number 4 is, in the post-COVID era especially, illness has really been taken more seriously. Before COVID, if you had an upper respiratory infection and you were coughing up green mucus and you were sneezing all over the place, people would sneeze into their hands, and wipe their nose and do all that kind of stuff. And then they would go to set. People were like, I'm not going to take a day off. Why? Because you weren't compensated for it. There were no paid days off in the film industry. And post-COVID, even during COVID, they were like, okay, if you get COVID, you're going to go home, but we're going to pay you for 8 hours. So that way you would at least get compensated for it. And one of the contract agreements on the return to work agreement was it included to have sick pay. So you were guaranteed a certain amount of sick pay to use. And that's something that people are now taking more seriously. And that's something that contracts are now starting to consider sick pay as something that is, believe it or not, a healthy thing to actually have on set. When you're on set and you're going to be there for extended periods of time, if someone gets sick, it's going to go around to the entire show, because that person's probably not going to take a day off and they're going to get everyone sick. So let's not go there, and let's allow them to actually recover at home. Being paid for 8 hours is something. So it's better than getting paid nothing. And that way they at least feel like they're getting paid for the day, for staying away and not bringing sickness to set. Because it used to be that the whole entire crew would become a cesspit. It was almost like a daycare, sending a kid to a daycare. One kid's going to sneeze in the face of another kid, and then everyone's going to end up with sick, and then they're going to bring it to their houses, and then every kid in the place is going to get pink eye and that kind of thing. That kind of stuff would happen on set. Someone would get sick and then bring it to set, and then everybody would end up getting sick from it. So if one person got the flu, everybody would get the flu. If people got a cold, it would go around set. And the medics usually would have all these different, cold remedies and stuff like that, just like they still do. But now, especially post-COVID, illness on set is being considered a lot more so than it used to be. It is something that people actually seem to care about. Another thing that popped up post-COVID was an intimacy coordinator. It was something that I guess you could say was more of a post-COVID related thing, even though I don't recall the term ever being used pre-COVID. I did P-Valley in 2019. I don't remember an intimacy coordinator by title, but there was probably somebody to coach on certain things. But then that show was very much one that it wasn't like, you work on a movie and there's going to be one nude scene. So on that, we're going to put up the blinds and make sure that only the people that need to see the monitor are, and only the key crew members can be on the stage. It wasn't anything like that. P-Valley, every single day, it was nobody wearing clothes. So it was like another day at the office, and people didn't care. It was just like, you would literally go up and start talking to someone and they were just completely naked. And you wouldn't even think anything of it because that was P-Valley. It was another day. And day players that would come aboard the show would be like, we're not doing any of the procedure we're supposed to do. And it's like, welcome to P-Valley. I mean, that's the way it was. And some shows are that way. I mean, depending on what they what the show is like and how they end up doing things. And it wasn't anything where the actors felt nervous and like one actor was like, you know what, I really wish we would actually abide by it. The actors were the ones that were the first people like, who cares? Don't even bother. The whole crew's going to see everything anyway. So they didn't care. If there was a crew member, if there was an actor or an actress that cared, then production would have also, but the actors didn't, because they knew what the show was and they knew what was going to end up happening. And that's the only reason why I'm really mentioning it, is only if there was a delicate type sequence would we end up, and usually the biggest support group were the crew members. We would end up saying, I remember that we did this. I was part of a show that did this scene where there was somebody in front of a mirror and they took off their clothes and then they kind of sat in front of the mirror and did different things with their looks, because it was a scene about reflection and, everything. And this is before intimacy coordinators. And this is one of those sequences where at the very end, it was a very emotional scene for the actor. And when it was done, there was a camera operator and a bunch of crew members went over and were just like, that was really touching. And that was, gave hugs and stuff like that. The actor really appreciated it. It was early in the show and the actor was like, that was really awesome. Thank you so much. But post-COVID especially, now there's intimacy coordinators that will sit down and have a conversation about what is and what is not acceptable and the proper way to do something and the comfort level of the people. They would ask certain questions to make sure that people would understand the limits and understand what would be, like if there's going to be a kissing scene, is there something that would be, that would make someone triggered, or that they just don't want that to happen, or, boundaries, I guess you could say. And there were some kissing scenes I remember pre-COVID, before there was intimacy coordinators, where people would kiss. And then I remember one show that it was a very passionate kiss and the guy reached down and grabbed her, posterior. And as soon as they cut, he didn't realize what he had done. He was like, I didn't realize it in the time. And then after I did it, I was like, okay, well, I guess we're acting. So they continued acting. She was just like, oh, it was in the moment. I didn't care. I thought it was funny, actually. So, but this day and age, you would work out all that kind of stuff in advance. If there was ever going to be a question or a concern, limitations, it would be covered by the intimacy coordinator, who would say, this is the realm of what is acceptable. And this is what this scene is. And this is what the director's vision is. And this is what we should do. What are your concerns? And now let's go over this. This is how it should be done. This is how to make sure that you simulate something. This is how to make sure you don't touch inappropriately, even inappropriately for like a sex scene or something like that. So this is something that now happens that didn't used to even only a few years ago as of the time of this recording. Another thing, and this is number 6, is capping rentals, or just not doing them in general. It used to be that if you, and I'm not talking about like sound mixers who have a package rental, that The sound mixer is hired as an employee, but then they also have a gear rental company that supplies gear to the production. And that is a company that's put on the certificate of insurance. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about if you have a kit, if you're a second AC, if you're even a Steadicam operator, if you're a boom operator and you have your boom kit and stuff like that. A lot of the times, the gear we need in order to actually use it on a show, we need to bring. And if the show says, we're not going to pay for that. Okay, do you just not bring a boom pole and say, you didn't buy it? You're not paying me to rent it. So I'm going to be holding a microphone out in front and I'll be, you can't do that. So a lot of shows, they started to actually pay rentals. But one of the things that's popped up in recent years is they started to cap that. They would say, okay, whatever the value is of your kit, we're not going to pay more than, originally, I think it was 70%. Then it became like 40%. So if, let's just say you have a $10,000 kit, 70% of that was $7,000. They would say, we're not going to pay you more than $7,000 for this show. So if you were on a short show that was a month and a half or something like that, no problem. If you were going to be on a 10-month-long show and your kit was $10,000 and you got $50 a day, that's $250 a week. You're talking about expiring. You're talking about not being, after 7 months, paid any more rental. And first ACs would have to spend a lot of money, and they don't get kit rental at all. And that's something that, if they do get kit rental, sometimes they would cap it and say, we're not going to pay more than 40% of the value of that, even though it's a rental. And the nature of the film industry has always been that it pays for itself pretty quickly. So if you end up renting a camera, you pay so much money for that, the camera's going to pay for itself in a matter of months. If you end up using a slider, it's going to pay for itself pretty quickly. Sound gear is the same exact thing. It's gonna be slower because there's tens of thousands of dollars that go into it. But if you get yourself a decent package rental, it's gonna pay for itself fairly quickly. Even if you end up renting out a Comtech a la carte. A Comtech could rent out for $50 a day. Comtech is only going to be a few $100s. It's going to pay for itself in, less than 10 days of use, unless you put it together in a package deal. And in which case you get multiples and with headphones and everything else. And you would have this as a certain package type deal. And some mixers have more expensive gear and some have less expensive gear and would charge more or less or whatever. But sound people in general, camera crew people in general, that is one thing that when kit rentals are being paid now, you have to look at the fine print, because sometimes those are being capped. Some studios say, we're not going to pay over a certain percentage of that, even though it's a rental, even though they are still getting benefit from that gear, just like they did on the first week of the show. If you're renting a piece of gear, it doesn't matter if you rent $1,000 piece of gear for $100 a day from a rental facility, and you decide you're going to use it for months and months and months, and that piece of gear was only $1,000, and you paid $10,000 in rentals for the entire show, doesn't matter. That's a company, and they have no problem doing that. They don't want to do that to individuals, though. They don't want to pay you for your gear, even though they're renting it. Some studios will actually, they would say, well, we have our own in-house production facility that you would actually, if you're a sound mixer there, they're not going to rent your gear. They're going to say, okay, we'll go over and make your package. So, okay, well, I want a Zaxcom recorder. I want to get the Zaxcom wireless. I'm going to use Electrosonics IFBs, and you're going to piece the whole thing together as part of your prep. And you're going to prep it all from their place. And if your recorder stops, working, or you need a new cable, or you need another wireless channel, you just go, you send your utility over there, and you're going to get the stuff from the in-house rental, and you'll bring it back. And some studios do it that way. In Georgia, we don't do it a whole lot that way. Most of the time, it's rented from the sound mixer, who will have more than enough gear for the entire show. And if there's a problem, you L&D it. Loss and damage. You just fill out the form, and production is going to replace it. It's going to be on the certificate of insurance. So that's one of the reasons why you need to have it. The seventh thing is VFX has changed a lot on set. And it's not just the ways that you might think of, this is going to be, it's going to be a digital character like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The seven dwarfs were CGI. They could have been actors playing it on set and then CGI'd later. When you end up like watching Alvin and the Chipmunks, the live action version of it, Alvin is real. I'm sorry, he's animated in a real world. When you watched, what was that movie about the alligator? I forgot what it is now, but it was an animated alligator, and it was only just a couple years ago. And you'll have animated creatures, and you'll end up animating entire creatures, like even the polar bear from the Dwayne Johnson movie from Christmas time 2024, Red One. The polar bear wasn't a real polar bear. He was standing on his hind legs and talking and stuff like that. Not surprisingly, that wasn't a real polar bear. That was a VFX creature. And on set, you will have VFX creatures. You will have VFX people. You work on something like, the Avengers, and you're going to have full motion capture sets and, actors that are wearing motion capture suits. And they have a little, camera that comes around from the side, and it puts a camera in front of their face to get all the dots on their face as to how they're performing. It's going to be modified by the camera, and you're going to have a microphone, a little lav mic that goes around as part of that too. When I did motion capture for Avengers Infinity War, for example, this is right after I left Walking Dead, where they would have 5 cameras doing the finale of the All Out War from season 8. And it would be, a lot to try to stay out of all those cameras, because they were constantly moving all over the place, and one's wider and just flings wider after take 4. And just, I went from that show to working on Avengers Infinity War in the motion capture studio, where everything around was green or blue. It was green. And then they had motion capture suits where they would literally have a camera operator that would hold this thing that looked like a monitor. And that was the camera. And it was digital in real time, where they could use that to kind of frame up a low res version of the character that they were shooting. And so the camera operator, and that could all be changed in post, because they had multiple cameras all around to capture all the dots. So all the camera operator was doing was kind of picking the angle that would be, most likely used on the show. But if post said, oh, I don't like the way that camera angle looks, they could digitally change it. But the camera operator there was providing a reference to the directors and that kind of thing on set. And so I went from Walking Dead, where I had to avoid everything, where they were like, you could be anywhere you want. So quite literally, I was standing next to the actors, and I had the boom right on top of their head, like literally here. And it didn't matter if the actor would walk and the camera operator stayed. I would walk between the camera operator and the actors, and I was invisible, because all the motion capture cameras there was 30, 40, something like that, however many there were, from all these different angles and heights and different positions around there. Those were what the actual image was being captured. It wasn't anything to do with me or the camera operator. So he said, you could be anywhere. I would literally walk in front of the camera operator, and it was like no big deal. He wouldn't even think anything of it. That didn't happen on Walking Dead. But VFX now will also change things, like, for example, if you have a lav that's visible, or you have a boom that dips into the shot, VFX will just smudge that stuff out. Captain Marvel, for example, the Captain Marvel chest plate actually had a piece of like wind protection with a lav poking through the actual thing, and then they just VFX'd it out completely as part of just the what they were going to do. And some shows, they say this is just going to be a VFX shot. So every time we see this chest thing, do whatever you want to, because the chest is actually going to be replaced in post. The entire chest piece is going to be lit up, or it's going to be VFX in some way. So don't worry about it. So do whatever you want to. Sometimes that's the way it is. And if there's an entire sequence that's done on a green screen, that's done on a motion capture, something like that, that makes it so much different than it is if you're shooting in a real location. Even then, VFX can still change things. And some shows, like I have a video about the invisible boom. And if you're on a set where there is an invisible boom technique going on there, where they're frozen a frozen shot, and then you basically go through and you take a plate and you use that to replace the boom. That happens, and it's a poor man's process. It's very, very easy to do. I could do it here on this channel. It so quickly. You literally just go boom, 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 and you circle around there and you freeze it. And it doesn't, if you don't move the shot and you don't change anything, it's very, very easy to do. And Post does that too, all day long. They can VFX things out very, very easily. It's as simple as highlighting around there, motion tracking, and it just knocks it out. And a lot of AI-based tools are going to make that stuff even easier in the future. So there you go. Another thing that you might not have considered about VFX is gunfire. Gunfire used to be, full loads, half loads, quarter loads, something like that, commonly used on set. There's electronic guns that you can use. It's like an eighth of the volume, sometimes even more than that. But the big thing that you lack is the kick, when you pull the trigger and the gun kicks. Because if it's an electronic gun, all it does is it does a little flash out the front, but the gun doesn't actually kick at all. Well, modern VFX can do that. It can add a kick really quick and easy with the muzzle flash and that kind of stuff. And it looks very natural. We did that on Walking Dead. On season 8 in the All Out War. Originally, we were shooting thousands of rounds in some of those big battles, and you would end up having the bullets flying out of the back of the shells, the casings, would fly out of the guns. And there were many times I'd be booming and I'd be running around, and I would be in a position where someone was shooting, and the position we would be in was where those shells were being ejected. And I would end up I'd be holding the boom like this, and I would have a hot shell land right on my neck here. And I'd be like, doing this number, trying to shift it off there while booming and that kind of stuff. That did happen, not just on Walking Dead, but on other shows too. And, so we would end up talking about, what angle is this going to come out and stuff like that. But some things happen. And on Walking Dead, we ended up I'm not going to get into it right now, but we ended up having a reason for going 100% digital with all of our gunfights. So we would have actors that were used to shooting, and it was very, very loud and it's very, very energetic, to them having to actually act and, pull the trigger and whatever, and have to act and duck down and whatever. And they pieced it together in post just fine. And it looked just like any of the other sequences. It was just a little more challenging for the actors. But gunfire can now be done completely VFX, which makes it a lot safer on set. Some entire scenes are done entirely in VFX, and you don't actually have to shoot them because the actors are CGI and the background is CGI. So all you need to do is have someone do a voiceover for the animated sequence, and you don't have to actually shoot it. Sometimes there's going to be a specialty, department or camera that's going to be just shooting like backgrounds of certain things for the CGI creatures. But if it's a CGI background, you don't even have to do that. It's just going to be created in visual, and all you have to do is record the actors' voices and then put it in there. And so you don't have to shoot those sequences at all. And there are some shows like The Mandalorian that shoots entirely on a stage. Almost every single scene is shot on their stage that wraps around, and it's a realistic looking screen. So they can shoot indoors for outdoors. And now back in, was it 2010, 2011, something like that, Vampire Diaries did end up they decided they were going to, they were shooting so much outdoors that sometimes it would rain, sometimes it would be just differences in schedule, and do they want to flip into overnight mode or whatever. And they decided they were going to take one of the stages. I forgot which one, but they made an entire outdoor woods sequence. So it was all pine straw on the ground, and they put trees that would go up there, and they would have branches and stuff coming off of them, and it looked like it was outdoors. And if you just kind of covered up the top of your eyes, you would not see anything above that. And when it was dark and they lit it properly on the inside, all the sequences that took place in there, you would never know it was shot on a stage. And they could do that in the day, they could do that at night, or whenever they wanted to. It was really, really a cool thing. But this day and age, in the world of green screen and blue screen and wrapping around these virtual sets and stuff, even on a show I did called Hindsight, where it was being shot, and it was a sequence, it was a show shot technically in New York, but we ended up having it was a really cool system where we had a green screen set it was built like a right angle, like a street that went down and then it curved or did a right angle. And we had plenty of sets that looked like the streets of New York. But then there were parts of it that were green screen. And we, in real time, did effects where you would see cars moving through. And so the actors could look at the monitor, and if they were supposed to be running across they would look and see a car coming, they would run across that, even though on set there was nothing. They would just act like there was a car there, and they would look at it. And then they would say, all right, cut, let's look at it. And then they would make a couple adjustments, and you would see it the way it looked. It looked like it was shot out on the city streets of New York. And this was a show I did almost 10 years ago. It was actually, hindsight's a really cool show. It's in general. And I tell you, because it was an MTV show, music, the soundtrack was really good. It was a show basically about a girl who in 2015 goes back 20 years on the eve of her second marriage. She goes back to the eve of her first marriage 20 years earlier. And when she goes back in time, the music's awesome. And so it's actually one of my guilty pleasures. I will go back and watch that show every now and then because it's a really good show. And it was cleared for a second season, but they never did it. I won't get into the reasons why, but it was a cool show. It was a really cool show. And it was a lot of fun to do too. But the reason I was mentioning is because of the virtual set. So anyway, VFX has changed a lot on film sets. The eighth thing I'll mention is wireless microphones. We used to boom everything. When it was one camera, you'd use the boom to play perspective to that. And whatever the sequence happened to be, you would end up recording it, and you would put a microphone on top of the camera, and you would point it at whatever the camera was pointed at. And so it would always look like it sounded. As soon as we started adding in multiple cameras, you would have a wide and you'd have a tight. The tight needed to sound like it was close. The wide shot needed to sound like it was loose. So what we started doing is putting lav mics on actors to get the close-up sound that we needed, because that was how we were going to sometimes do coverage. We weren't going to be doing tight shot with tight shot. We would do a wide and a tight. So we ended up adding wireless microphones and putting them on actors a lot more often than we used to. And in the early days of digital, it was pretty well early established that everybody who has a speaking role is going to have a wireless microphone. Actors originally hated it. Some actors would say, I don't want to end up wearing one of those things. And after a while, those same actors would come back and they would say, okay, where do I go to get my wire? And they just knew that was part of the process at that point. They would say, where do I go to get it? There was one show I worked on where there was an actress who refused. She's like, I don't want to have to wear a wire. I don't want to have to wear a wire. And then we would, because of the workflow, we would have to do wides and tights to make our days. And she did not want to wear a wire. So I would end up putting plants all over the place. But as soon as she started getting called in to post, to do ADR for basically any scene that we would have to put a plant mic on, because she would want to maybe be farther away from a table, and there would be no place to put a plant mic except unless it was farther away, or there would be no place to secure one because it would be a dining room table and there would be nothing on it. And it was like the only place I could be is really high, or I could try to hide something in the napkin holder on the table, but it was going to be far away and the acoustics were going to be bad. As soon as she realized that if she wore a wire, she didn't have to hardly do any ADR, she started wearing a wire all the time. All she had to do had to be taught. And that's what it is education in all ways. The ninth thing I'll mention is smoke on set. Not just people smoking. Sure, people used to actually smoke on set, and I do remember that. But I mean like things like even fog machines. Fog machines, we used to use oil-based foggers. And so it would fog up and the air would be thick with the oil-based fog, and it would stay in the air. But another thing that would happen is like this residue. If it was a club sequence, you'd have this like little fine residue on everything. It would feel a little gunky. So that was something that was replaced by water-based fog machines. People would always say, oh, I'm having breathing problems in here because I can't breathe from it. Well, guess what? People are doing that same thing with the water-based ones, even though they're completely safe. Just like the oil ones were considered safe. I mean, technically, you're not really supposed to breathe in anything, but they're safe. The water-based ones, though, you will sometimes, if you're on a show, they can't just fog it up 2 or 3 minutes before and then it's going to hang in the air the entire sequence. What a lot of shows will have to do if it's a whole nightclub type sequence, they're not going to be able to put foggers out all over the set and then kill it and the scene takes place over 3 minutes, because by the end of the 3 minutes, all of the fog is going to be dissipated. So what they'll do is they will flood with not just these hazer, but these heavy duty like mist is going to be over the entire stage. So the entire stage is going to have this thick fog. So that way that it's not going to have anywhere to dissipate. If you put fog all over the set and then you stop the fog, it's going to dissipate. But now what they'll do is the set will have foggers on there too, but then everything around it in the soundstage is going to be dense fog as well. So that way it's not going to dissipate. It's all going to even out and it's going to be misty. It's going to be foggy by the end. And that's something that we've had for probably the better part of 10 plus years. One of the last shows I remember actually doing the oil-based foggers was Hindsight, as a matter of fact. And I remember it was something that production said, can you use the water-based one? And they said, no, we use the oil-based ones. And they ended up, I think, changing it midway through production because production said, no, we want to use the water-based ones because it was such long days on set that they were like, okay, well, we really do need to have more of the water-based ones. But the special effects team was not happy about it, but they ended up doing it because production wanted them to. And, in post, they'll always cut around and make it look like it. But there are some scenes that look a little bit less foggy than others earlier in the show. And that's just the nature of the science behind the fog. But even in the early days that I was on set, they would burn all kinds of things in order to give a fog on set. It wasn't just necessarily just the hazers and the fog machines, that kind of thing. They would sometimes burn like this incense that monks use. I remember doing a show and we're like, gosh, it was just gagging us. It was like, what is that smell? It's so strong. And like, oh yeah, it's this incense that monks use. And we're just like, gosh, do you have to use it? And they're like, well, it's making a nice thick that just stays in the air. And it's a really good effect. It looks good on camera, but it smelled terrible. And before my time, they would burn tires to make, black smoke and stuff like that. And they burn all kinds of stuff that was just not healthy at all. But this day and age, a lot more healthy on set. So that was something that for our topic number 9, that's something that is definitely taken seriously. Even people that smoke on set, they now use artificial cigarettes. They'll do that. So it's not even the real cigarettes. They'll use fake ones. I mean, people used to smoke on set. And number 10, there are now a lot more resources than there used to be. And this is around the entire industry. Like, for example, supplies. When we used to wire people up, they would have to take paper tape or gaffer tape or something like that, and you'd have to make a football out of it, and you'd have to do it in certain ways to put a lav inside of it to sandwich it and put it underneath clothing. And it took skill to actually hide it because it was going to be a little puffy or whatever. But this day and age, there are dozens of accessories for you to make different wireless microphones for different types of clothing work. Various degrees of wind protection, various degrees of, do you need a broad clip? Do you need a clip that goes through the buttonhole? Do you need to have some special adhesive that will not stick well to clothing, that will close in this gap right here if you have a lav there, and that will freeze the material together? There's all these different tricks of the trade. And not just that, online resources have made education and made it so much easier to get information. It used to be that you would have to the only way you ever learned something is if you worked on a show with someone that taught it to you. And many people guarded their secrets. People would say, look, I have a career of 30 years. Why in the world am I going to teach you some of this stuff? I'm not going to teach you that. You're a day player. I'm not going to teach you any of these tricks. I have developed the techniques and the way I do things over 30 years. I'm not going to teach it to you. And they would sometimes not do that. But this day and age, someone asks a question online, people will post pictures of what will work. They will answer them very, very detailed and exclusively. Even this channel here, that is at the time of this recording, has been releasing weekly content for almost 8 years. That was something that we did not have back in the day. There was no video platform that would teach you stuff. It was not the kind of thing where if you watched a video that would teach you a certain technique, you'd say, I want to ask a question, and you go underneath the comments, and then the person who actually released the video will answer that and maybe even turn it into another episode of something to discuss it. Now there's YouTube content all over the place. There's forums all over the place online where you can ask questions and people will answer, not just JW Sound, but there's also Facebook groups and there's online resources, just books that you can buy. You can watch free YouTube videos, get a lot of information that you would not normally have been able to outside of a film school. And the film school information back in the day used to be a lot about, they would be very outdated, or at least somewhat outdated, because tech would move faster than people were able to upgrade their gear, and the gear was a lot more expensive and you didn't know what you were going to be getting. This day and age, a lot of that gear is a lot more price effect. It's a lot cheaper. Best way to word it. So it used to be that you would know from an expendables list exactly what you were getting. Whenever you would buy certain things, it was always the same kind of thing. So always the same expendables, and people would have to creatively figure out ways of using it all. But this day and age, you have so many different accessories. Oh, we're going to be doing this kind of a sequence. So let me buy this particular thing. And then not just that, remember the VFX thing we were talking about earlier. Maybe you can use a certain lav on somebody that's not wearing a shirt. There's a guy that's wearing, just makeup, body makeup or something like that. You can put a lav on them in plain sight, and then it's going to be covered up by VFX later because it's a CGI person or a sequence. Or like Drax on Guardians of the Galaxy. You would say, well, he's not wearing a shirt. No, but he's wearing different appliances that go on top to give him that vein look. And if you look at the time lapse online, you will see that one of the very first steps that's done is they start to put the things on Drax is they route around a wireless microphone and right to the center of the chest, and then they cover it up with the veins and the appliances because that's something that they can do. And then if they need to, they can tweak it in post. But there I go, getting on to VFX again. My main point is that we have so many more resources available to us now, from suppliers and vendors that make products specifically for us in access. We have the ability to buy any of this stuff, even at sound shops and places that we used to just have to make the stuff, or we would have to go and hopefully Dr. Scholl's Moleskin was not going to be sold out at the local CVS, Walgreens, Eckerd Drugs, whatever it happened to be. You might be able to grab it. And then we started using bunion cushions. Then the company started creating additional things in addition to just the top stick, super stick, or Joe sticky stuff we would use, the butyl tape. There's now so many different accessories. Rycoat was had some of the first accessories that were made for lavs, and now there's Viviana, Ursa, Bumblebee, all these different companies making them. And they're all so good compared to what we used to have. So there you go. 10 things that are different now than they used to be 25 years ago. I know this was a longer episode. Thanks for staying with me. It's been fun to reminisce this. But anyway, thanks for tuning this episode of the SoundSpeeds podcast. And I will see you in the future with more episodes. Have a question you'd like answered or want to add something? Be sure to write it in the comment section down below. You can also make a suggestion for future topics of discussion. Again, comment section down below, or you can email me at soundspeeds@yahoo.com. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on future sound advice.